Hello and welcome to Better Under Pressure. I'm Sara Milne Rowe, author of The Shed Method and founder of Coaching Impact. And in this podcast, I talk to leaders from all walks of life about being better under pressure and using pressure for better. I want to explore how we handle pressure in a world that is becoming more and more complex, the impact that pressure has on our ability to perform at our best, and what we do to be better under pressure.
You perceive people with a job title as like this otherworldly being. Like they're still human beings. It just is that they've been either at the game longer than you or they're just higher up the ranks than you. But they're still a human being with like loved ones and friends and family and goals, dreams, hopes, ambitions. But I think sometimes the corporateness of a job title can make the perception or the perceived situation really terrifying for some people. So from a senior leadership point of view, adding that element of humanity is just priceless for great leadership. Yeah. And as somebody that's kind of progressing up their career, playing that up and down, so intentionally building relationships with people up and down and helping to pay it forward, or whether it's opening doors or just connecting people to try and neutralize that stigma of, well, they're really senior, which means they're unapproachable. It's the perception of the situation rather than oftentimes the reality.
Today, I'm talking to Mollie Pearse, Meta's head of marketing for EMEA. Having started her career as an entrepreneurial businesswoman and quickly learning the power of true audience-first marketing, she's since led teams at IMG, Octagon, HSBC and LinkedIn before arriving at Meta. Mollie inspires her teams to think differently about commercial goals, enabling them to surpass expectations. When she isn't doing that, she's out exploring the limits of human potential by running, swimming and cycling ultra distances to expand her comfort zone and raise money for charity. As I spoke with Mollie, it soon became abundantly clear that there were far too many nuggets to squeeze into a single 50-minute podcast, so we broke it into two conversations. In this, our first conversation, Mollie shares how hating sport as a child helped her gain power over her environment, what she learnt from swimming in open water through jellyfish, and why we should all have our personal board of directors.
Mollie, thank you so much for coming on Better Under Pressure. I'm so excited about talking to you.
Yeah, it's absolutely lovely to see you. I've got my water here as well, so if I'm swigging throughout, just...
Brilliant. No, that's very good. Well, we love that, don't we? We love the swigging of the water, the hydration. How would you describe your relationship with pressure? Because I know that pressure sits in various different parts of your life.
Yeah.
But how would you actually describe your relationship with it?
I would firstly say, it's definitely evolved. And I think pressure previously I would have seen as a bit of a threat and something to be feared. But I think as I've progressed through my career and in my sporting life, I've, as Billie Jean King says, like pressure is a privilege. And for me, it's the presence of pressure that I need to perform to be a high performer. And I think it's something that comes up for me. I know when pressure is present, that's when it matters and that's when the stakes are high. And it's almost like a bit of a special sauce and a magic that says to me, this is a critical moment. Like, what are you going to do with it? And I think the way that it's evolved, as I say, it's like something that I did fear. And now it's something that I relish and it's something that I think, great, when pressure is here, I know I need to step up and I'm ready for it. And I think the evolution has come through learning and testing and stepping into very uncomfortable positions. But importantly, reflecting on that and thinking when pressure has been present and then that episode has ended, what was it from that scenario and that situation that I learned? How did the pressure show up? How did it manifest throughout? And what was the outcome? Like, what would I know differently next time to help me to deal with it?
Okay, there's a couple of things in there that I really, really want to pick up. One of them is this idea of its evolution, but also you've been so proactive within that journey of evolution. And often when I talk to people about pressure, and even, in certain areas of my own life, when pressure hits, it's very easy to not engage with it in that sort of way, to think, okay, you called it what, a secret sauce or something,
like
that's
sauce, yeah.
Right. So, how do you how have you learned to have that relationship with it? Because it is, I mean, it's interesting. The question was about your relationship with pressure, and it feels very much in your description that it is a relationship. So how have you evolved it in that way so that it's become a secret sauce, as opposed to something that someone else might describe as, takes me out, or,
Yeah, I think, one of my first memories of feeling pressure or feeling uncomfortable, because for me, like, the discomfort and pressure are fairly synonymous. And one of my first memories of that feeling was I was young. I can't remember, like, I don't know, 9, 10. And I was on the start line of like a cross country race at school. And I hated sport at school. And I'd basically been put in to do this cross country race because I'd probably misbehaved, or I was, not paying attention in class. And I went to a local comprehensive in southeast London. So it was November and I was in like shorts and a vest. And I just remember thinking, this is awful. Yet my parents, and my dad especially, I'd remember he'd said to me before that, and then like many times subsequently, don't let the environment change you. You just have to lean into what it has to teach you. So I think there's been, from a very early age, consciously or otherwise, this innate curiosity of like, what is that feeling and what is it going to do for me? So I think that was almost a foundation. And I think growing up in an environment where curiosity is highly valued, that's then enabled me to continue to lean into it and to try and unpick, well, what does it mean and where can it take me?
So on that starting line as a 9 or 10-year-old and feeling like this is awful, and then recalling your father's statement, what did that allow you to do in that moment? Can you remember?
Well, I think I probably thought in that moment, well, I've got to go anyway. Like, I can't just not run. And I can't remember that time specifically. I just remember afterwards thinking, oh, it really wasn't that bad. That was actually quite good fun. So it was almost like a collection of memories, like just adding to it. Okay, so that time that was actually really fun. Well, what happens if we do that again? That there's fun associated with that rather than terror. And I think as I've gone through life, it's actually understanding that if that feeling of pressure is present within me, that actually there's an adventure coming. And that actually the adventure is the excitement.
Has that always been the case, Mollie? I mean, what's the worst pressure? Like, because I've had people on this podcast, and they've had some pretty extraordinary moments of pressure, and they haven't seen it as a secret sauce. And actually, it's been pretty hardcore. But have you ever had pressure that has been bigger than you?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think when I was 19, I was the victim of a pretty horrendous sexual assault. And I didn't deal with that at all at the time. And it wasn't until I was about 30, so 11 years later, that a number of events have unfolded and I just crumbled, basically. And I'd been running away from that from then. And the pressure of not dealing with that had built and built and built. And it basically all came crashing down. And I had the realization that everything that I'd been doing in that period, in that time frame, the pressure and the motivation had been driven by shame and had not been driven by me and what I was wanting to do. So yes, there was that sort of learned behavior of like, pressure is good and you continue to go, but I wasn't doing it on my terms. And for me, that pressure built so much that I was, at the time I was working full time. I was part of the age group Team GB triathlon team. I was training really hard. I was doing all of these things. And actually I was like, yeah, the pressure's great. Go, 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 go. But I was doing it. I was being motivated by shame. Like, I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I need to do this to prove myself. And actually it was through the unraveling of that. And actually the deep kind of work to find out, where has that come from? And why am I feeling in that way, to actually let go of it, that the balance and the pendulum then swung back, and actually the pressure then became back as like, yes, the pressure's still there and it still adds a level of drive and ambition, but it's also freeing and it's empowering. So like that was bigger than me, because I let it get bigger and manifest in a negative way. So I think I just find human motivation fascinating. And I think understanding how you feel the pressure, but why, importantly, like why you feel the pressure and what maybe historical narratives or events in your life and stories have built to that and the way that it shows up.
First of all, I'm really pleased you brought that in. Because I think sometimes when you're just talking about sport and pressure, there's a sense of, well, that's part of the sport. That's part of what you're drilled to do. That's part of the discipline of, what you learn to do when you're doing the sort of endurance sport that you're doing. Yeah. What's so interesting already about what you've shared, when a very traumatic personal event happens, that pressure is rooted, or in your description, is rooted in something deeper. In your words, the shame of that. And so you said you run away from it, or you've spent from 19 to 30 running away from it. That's what's so interesting about the dynamic of pressure, I think, is you can deal with it over in one part of your life, potentially, or with one person that builds pressure for you. And yet in other areas of your life, it bosses you, as opposed to you. I said, do pressure on your terms. Love that. Like, how can how can we take the learning from the whole humanness of our life and apply it in different places and in different ways? This sense of being, my words, not yours, but scientist on your pressure, on how you experience it, then how you choose to deal with it. I mean, do you feel now that the whole relationship that you have with pressure is this secret juice that actually allows you to be better?
Yeah. I know now that if I get that feeling, if the pressure is there, that it's something important, and there's, I'm on the precipice of an adventure, and it's like, it's that interpretation of it. It will either be arduous or it will be an adventure, and your interpretation and how you decide how you show up to that will dictate, the subsequent steps. And I think, your point around pressure in sport is a good one. And I think the presence of pressure is critical. It's really important. But how you deal with that pressure, and taking, the famous Viktor Frankl quote, between stimulus and response, there is space. So taking that time to do a body scan, check, and this is like real split second stuff in, when you're an elite sports person, but do a body scan. Where is that pressure showing up? What's it doing for me? Am I hot? Am I sort of slightly shaking? How is that then going to impact the next move? And it's no different in a business context, because if you're going into a presentation, and it's another thing that my mum and dad always used to say, if you're going into an interview or a presentation, you're nervous. So your shoulders are probably high, you're a bit tense, like you're probably quite flushed. Just smile, because it physically relaxes, it will send the right chemical reaction from your brain, to how your, physical presence is to show up. But take that second, deep breath, smile, and off you go. And there's those small micro goals that you can just implement on a day-to-day basis to embrace, but also sometimes change your relationship with pressure, so that it's not something to be feared.
Yeah. And how do you do that with the people that you lead in Meta, for example, or in any of the worker circumstances and working environments that you've been in, Mollie? How do you help someone who you see around you feeling pressure and you're thinking it's not really pressure, or if you change your relationship with it, it could be incredibly exciting or innovative or allow you to be better? How do you lead someone when they're under pressure?
I think it's a lot about the curiosity of helping that person to understand what is the actual pressure? Like, what are you feeling physically? How is it showing up? And understanding why. Like, is there anything historically that's led them to interpret it in that way? So people in a work context, people can, be overwhelmed with, I've got to do this deck, and I've got this deadline, and I've got all these meetings, and like, I've got no time in my day. And is, what is it about that? Or how does that make you feel? Just to bring them out of the hamster wheel, and to just take a moment to sort of pause and reflect, to think about it in a human context. Like, how does your body feel in that moment? So I think trying to encourage people to take that space and understanding a bit more in themselves, what is that physiological reaction that I'm getting? So that for the next time, as soon as they start to get that, sort of feeling of, it could be anxiety or it could be excitement, but as soon as they start getting it, okay, well, what can I do within my control to sort of just simmer that down? And also, why am I feeling this pressure? Is it because what I'm doing means a lot to me? Or is it because what I'm doing is scary because I worry about what people think of me? And then the path I would take with those two things are also very different. So it's a lot more about understanding the sort of what the pressure is, how it's felt, and why they're feeling it, and then exploring different ways to sort of play with it, really.
Yeah, you sort of mentioned three things which I think are sit underneath most of the conversations I'm having, is that either the stakes are high because it really matters in some way, or it's volume, just too much of it, or it's uncertain. You know, that you're operating in an environment that's hugely uncertain and unknown. And it feels like those are the three ingredients that tend to play out that provokes this secret juice, you know, in terms of enabling you to, as you say, in that split second, respond in a way that's going to be useful to you. Can you talk us through a recent pressure, either work or sport or personal, where talk us through your process, Mollie?
Yeah, I mean, one entertaining example that I sometimes share is I swam from Jersey to France with a friend not so long ago. And, you know, we were really well trained. When we signed up for the challenge, we can swim, but that Jersey to France is quite a long way. And you start at night and it's, you know, several hours rather than just swimming in a pool. There's lots of sort of unknown factors, but we thought we ticked all the boxes and we were like, we're so well trained. We've got the nutrition covered, swimming at night, all good. But we didn't know that there was going to be this kind of unseasonably warm weather front that essentially caused a massive bloom of jellyfish. So I started the swim at sort of, I think it was 4 a.m. and it was pitch black. So I was like merrily swimming along, thinking, wow, all the water coming off my hands is like diamonds. This is amazing. I'm having the best time ever. And then I got out for my friend to jump in to do her leg. And I stood on the boat and I was like, what are all those blue dots in the water? And the captain was like, yeah, they're the jellyfish. And in the moment, I was like, well, I'm not getting back. And my first thought was, I'm not getting back in the water. And of course, we had to get back. I had to. Yeah. So my first reaction was like, danger. There's jellyfish everywhere. But I thought, hang on a minute. You think they're dangerous, but they're not necessarily. So it's like interpreting the stimulus. And I was like, okay, well, what can I do there? So I said to the captain, are they stingers? And he said, yeah, but it's nothing more than like a nettle.
Yeah.
I was like, right, okay. But as we were going along, there were just more and more and more. And then my friend in the water was getting really distressed. So she jumped out. And then I was like, okay, well, I've got to get back in. But because he'd said to me, they're just like, it will just be like rubbing your hand against a nettle bush, but repeatedly for however long I have to swim. But in that moment, I thought, okay, I can interpret that as dangerous and I'm not going in, or I can interpret it as I'm fine. It's not going to hurt me. I'm fit. I know how to swim. The water's great. It's not particularly windy. Just go for it and see what happens. So I jumped in slightly begrudgingly, but jumped in and just went for it. And actually, yes, from the boat, the perspective meant that there were jellyfish everywhere. But of course, you get into the ocean and the expanse is vast. So actually the jellyfish weren't everywhere. They were sort of once every 10 meters or something. And just because they were once every 10 meters, it didn't mean you were going to get stung. So it was the interpretation of the stimulus. And then again, the curiosity of just because they're there doesn't mean I'm going to get repeatedly stung. And I just loved also playing with the different perspectives, like standing above on the boat looked horrendous. Being in the water, there weren't actually that many. I mean, there were plenty, but the reality was it wasn't as big a deal as I'd sort of thought it was. Yeah. First and foremost. So then I was like, oh, this is actually quite fun. And then it sort of became a bit more of a game of like, okay, well, I can see one up ahead. I now need to sort of swim past it and change my stroke, which actually then made the next 2 hours just fly by.
Oh, just fly by. It's all relative, isn't it? But okay. Yeah. That's such a great example. And also this whole idea of perspective taking. I think so often we're just in our own world in relation with the thing that's delivering what we're perceiving as pressurizing. Yeah. But if we could just pause and look at it from different perspectives, what that story illustrates to me is that if we pause enough to do that, there's a richness in how we see it.
I want to talk a bit more about this idea of perspective taking. Let's break down the situation Mollie's just described. Firstly, she's in a sea of jellyfish and has been swimming for a while amongst them, probably also being stung. But she doesn't even notice this because her focus is drawn to the beauty of the sparkle that they're creating in the water on her hands. This really brings to life for me the power of the phrase, "Our energy flows where our attention goes." She didn't even notice. Once she gets back into the boat, however, then she becomes aware of just how many jellyfish are actually in the water, and her dog brain, based on her instinct and intuition, quickly decides, well, you're definitely not getting back in there. And it's at this point that we hear Mollie's process. Firstly, she pauses before making any decision and checks the data by asking the captain if their sting is actually dangerous. Once she knows that it isn't, the desire to complete the challenge becomes stronger than the fear, so much stronger that she's quick to take over from her swimming partner and does the next section amongst the jellyfish. In fact, she turns it into a game. How can I adjust my stroke to avoid as many jellyfish as possible? I think becoming more aware of how we are, as Mollie says, interpreting the stimulus is the start. Often we bypass this and we fail to check what story we are running, because there's always a story, either a helpful one or an unhelpful one. We have the chance to choose, if we pause enough, however, to check before reacting. It doesn't have to be long, it could be seconds. There's so much to extract from Mollie's jellyfish episode that can be applied to other situations. But this is what I've captured. Number 1, pause. Remember the infamous Viktor Frankl quote, "Between stimulus and response, there's a space." It's worth noticing how you create that space for yourself. Do you breathe? Walk away for a few seconds? Close your eyes? 2, check the facts. Ask yourself, is this story I'm running actually true? What perspective can I seek out that might help or challenge me? 3, connect to the bigger purpose. What purpose can I connect to that is bigger or greater than my fear right now? 4, reframe. How can I make this fun or more of a game? Or look at it with curiosity and lightness? Personally, I've now got a new question I'm going to ask myself when I next feel fear. Sara, how can you have fun with those jellyfish?
I was on a podcast towards the end of last year, and it was more about like what, I think I was saying like, what can jellyfish teach you about being in the boardroom? Because I think we often perceive, and especially if you look in corporate organizations, you perceive people with a job title as like this otherworldly being. Like they're still human beings. It just is that they've been either at the game longer than you, or, they're just higher up the ranks than you. But they're still a human being with like loved ones and friends and family and goals, dreams, hopes, ambitions. But I think sometimes the corporateness of a job title can make the perception or the perceived situation really terrifying for some people. So I always think, from a senior leadership point of view, adding that element of humanity is just, priceless for great leadership. Yeah. And as somebody that's kind of progressing up their career, playing that up and down, so intentionally building relationships with people up and down and helping to pay it forward, or whether it's opening doors or just connecting people to try and neutralize that stigma of, well, they're really senior, which means they're unapproachable. Yeah. Because again, it's the perception of the situation rather than oftentimes the reality. Yeah.
What do you think is the role of what we would call purpose energy in this, the sense of a bigger meaning than this particular pressure that's in front of me? How does that play out for you? What do you think about that in terms of a source?
Purpose energy for me is very grounding and very kind of unifying. So it keeps me on the track of what I'm wanting to do. And it's important as well. It's incredibly important to sort of who I am and what I'm trying to do. So I know, therefore, that pressure is going to be present. And actually, if the pressure is not present, then is the decision I'm making or the space in which I'm playing big enough? Am I playing it small just in case it doesn't work out?
Yeah.
So I think that, the two things for me are very much intertwined, because for me, when the stakes are high, pressure is always present.
Yeah. And how do you, in a way, intentionally do that? What I see in a lot of organizations right now, and what leaders are telling me, the pressure of doing so much stuff and getting through so many things, or hitting particular financial targets or measures, have they lose touch with that sense of, why am I doing this? What am I doing? And I know, there's a lot spoken about the power of why, but what's the practice of that? How, and I know, you and I have spent some time together recently this month, but that whole idea of how do you help yourself lift yourself out of this immediacy into the longer term gain, or what it's there for, in order to be able to propel you forward. I'm just wondering how, because that is a practice, isn't it?
It is. And I also think it was interesting when you were talking there about different pressures and sort of targets and days and people's diaries. I think it's important to make a distinction between the different types of pressures that are present, because busy diary, like a long commute, looming deadlines, financial targets, those are pressures, there's no doubt about it, but they're quite superficial. There's not necessarily a depth to them, back to the sort of purpose piece. And I think they're pressure, but they become a stressor, whereas the pressure in terms of going towards your purpose, and that you're operating to do something bigger than yourself, that's the pressure that Billie Jean King was referring to, I believe, when she said pressure is a privilege. So therefore it kind of begs the question for me of, okay, so if the pressure I'm feeling is to do with like my diary and the 500 things I'm trying to fit in my 24-hour window, what can I do to manage those, and how can I alleviate some of that? So that might be like I look at my diary on a Friday and plan it for the following week. And at the moment I'm training for I've got an Ironman in 3 weeks' time. So training is pretty busy, work is very busy, and I commute in from Sussex. So everything is not possible in all this time, and then I have friends and a family and everything else. So something has to give. And it's like, what is causing the most stress? That can I just take out? And whether that's meetings, it could be a training session, it could be working from home an extra day. So it's like the surface level operational things that you are in control of. And then in addition to that, we've spoken about it a lot, but making sure that your mind and your body is in the best place to be able to deal with those pressures, and that, as you are sort of famous for, sleep, hydration, exercise, and diet, those 4 guiding principles, if any of those drop, then the pressure is going to be interpreted as probably a lot bigger than it needs to be, and we're can be blowing those things out of proportion.
Yeah. I really like this distinction between pressure and stressor, because I think sometimes people put pressure and stress in the same bucket. And I think for me, the reason I wanted to, have these conversations is because of all of you, the pressure allows us to be better and bigger and serve bigger purpose. But sometimes that gets replaced by, as you've just said, these irritants, these stressors, these overwhelmed moments that actually we then feel we have no choice over managing.
Yeah.
And so we lose our agency in any choices or decisions that we are able to make, actually, in that split second between stimulus and response.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's also, yes, a lot of it is on us, but I'm also a massive believer in, life is a team sport. So I have my own kind of personal board of directors, as I would call it. And those are, mentors, sponsors, friends, family, because you need to have that different perspective from people as well, to tell you when you need to rein it in, or to tell you, to push you when you're not, playing big enough. So they, for me, are like, I know how to sort of deal with pressure when I feel it, but sometimes I just miss the bar, and actually I need somebody on the outside to push me or to rein me in. And I think having a personal board of directors is just such an important life factor to just also help you navigate what inevitably will be thrown at you.
Yes. I mean, such a great a great thing to do. And, you know, putting the personal into the idea of a board is great. So useful. And again, it means that you have to take yourself seriously as well.
Yeah.
Actually. And that these people are there for a reason, because you believe you can learn. And I think,
and you have to be vulnerable as well, right? You have to show up and tell these people what it is you're trying to do.
Yes.
And that could be, you know, I'm training for a race. That could be, I'm trying to juggle all of these things. That could be, I'm going for a promotion. That could be, I want to change the world and this is my idea. Like, in all of those contexts, you know, you might think, actually, this is a really lofty goal. But if you don't say it out loud and start telling your brain about it, you've got to hold yourself accountable, but you also have to have people to help you do that. And I think sometimes showing up with those ideas can seem a bit silly, but you know, there's a reason that they're your personal board of directors, because they're there to champion you and they're there to push you. So they need to understand, you know, what it is, what are your dreams, and what is this pressure helping you to get to?
Yeah. It also demands an element of you being prepared to stop and slow down to speak to them.
Yes.
And I think that's something that I'm really mindful of. And it's almost like a test of the appetite when I'm choosing to work with someone. It's like, are they prepared to slow down enough to commit to the time that actually this contract, this relationship needs for me to be able to be useful to them? And sometimes, you know, people are just constantly bossed by other things.
They want to hear it as well. Are they open to newer perspective as well, I guess?
Yeah. What do you think is your current pressure, Mollie, that you are focusing on and using these tools and skills and techniques that you've just shared actively?
Yeah, I think there's two, one sporting and then one from a work context. But the sporting one is, you know, I'm doing an Ironman in 3 weeks' time. And it's interesting because I've done a lot of triathlon in the past, like Ironman 70.3 distance. And I've since, so the last one I did was 5 years ago. And then I've done a lot of trail running and endurance, like ultra marathons and endurance swimming in the interim, which requires a completely different mindset. So you just basically zone out and off you go because you're in zone 2. It's not easy, but it's, you know, it's a sort of meditative state for me. And that's sort of where I've got to with those. Whereas triathlon, although a long duration, it's 3 different sports and it's going to be quite intense at times, whether that's the start of each phase or climbing up a mountain on the bike or getting off the bike and going onto the run. So as I've been training, I've been kind of interpreting that pressure in the way of, okay, well, how is this going to show up? And like, what am I going to do? What are the different scenarios that, you know, could present, and how do I want to play with it as I go, you know, into that race? I think when I was messaging you the other week, like I was on my bike and I really didn't want to be on the bike, but I was like, okay, it's not even about the fitness. Sometimes it's just about building some mental resilience for an hour and a half, just like slogging it out. So playing with that pressure, and when it shows up, just asking questions of it, I think, which you can do when the stakes are a bit lower and in the sporting space, because it is just a hobby.
Yes, and actually you said, didn't you, just sorry to interrupt you, but you said, yes. I remember, that you were going to send me a text saying, I'm struggling on the bike right now, but you stopped yourself from using that word.
Yeah, and I think from, you know, spending some incredibly valuable hours with yourself and with Simon, you know, how we interpret those narratives and those thoughts. I remember I was training for a 24-hour ultra run a few years ago, and I was working with Simon from a mindset perspective, and like some of his pushes were just invaluable. Like, you know, once those thoughts come, have a conversation with them, you know, like, oh yeah, you're showing up, are you? Oh yeah, what are you going to add? Okay, great, bye, and move on. Like, you know, people might think you're nuts, but it's just, you know, just like let that sort of ego go and just play with it and see what happens. And I have to say, I've found that in training and in a work context, just such an interesting space to play. And there's some research that's just been done, some neuroscientific research to show that there is a part of your brain that grows, that physically grows when you do those things that you don't want to do. And it's a lot smaller in people that are morbidly obese, people that are, you know, have chronic illnesses, or it's a lot bigger in people that are, into their sort of 80s and 90s. And I just thought that's such an interesting concept. So
yes,
when you don't want to do something, just think, right, well, once I've done this, like my brain is growing. And
it has to be something you truly don't want to do. For me, it's turning my shower cold when I really don't want to. But, I just, every time now I think of that, well, I'm growing my brain. I'm making it stronger just by choosing not to get out of the shower in the heat, but to get out of the shower after I've turned it cold for 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah. I love that.
For those of you who are curious, by the way, the part of the brain that Mollie is referring to is the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, that according to research, we can actually grow, but only through doing things we really do not want to do. But I actually want to touch on the concept of having conversations with the uninvited voices that take up space in our heads. This is definitely worth playing with, to give those negative thoughts less power. I once worked with a lawyer who described those unhelpful voices in her head as 2 small girls, sitting one on each shoulder, whispering unhelpful things. They whispered to her about everything that could possibly go wrong. I remember actually her exact words. She said to me, "They reprimand me, Sara, for having the arrogance to even believe I could do it in the first place." She seemed to know them really well. So we had fun working on a light and intentional practice for her to use when those girls next turned up in moments of high challenge. Before entering a boardroom, she would physically brush a hand across both shoulders to knock the girls off and say to them, internally obviously, "You wait out here, I won't be long." And then she'd put her shoulders back, walk into the room and close the door firmly behind her. As our unhelpful voices rarely wait to be asked for their opinion, it helps to have a practice like the one Mollie describes, where she says in a fun way, "Oh, you've turned up again, have you? Bye." It's important to keep it light, to have fun with them. Remind them that you've got this, not them. While we're on the subject of who we listen to, do you have your personal board of directors like Mollie? Because one way of lessening the power of our unhelpful internal voices is to create our own external board of voices. People who we actively lean into, people who champion us, offer advice and provoke our thinking. Who are they for you? Be intentional and know who they are. Maybe you have one of sorts already, but it needs a refresh. As the saying goes, we are an average of the 5 people we spend most time with. Who's raising your game right now? Who makes you feel more alive to possibility? Who do you want on your personal board of directors?
I asked you the question of what's the current pressure you're dealing with at the moment, and you said yes, the triathlon.
Yeah.
The Ironman, sorry, and the other one.
Yeah, I just think in a work context,
yes,
when you're thinking about going for another role and you've been in a role for a certain number of years and you have, a reputation and credibility and you kind of know what you're doing. But, for me, there's a niggling feeling of like, okay, but you're very comfortable now. So like, where is the growth? And actually, it's like stepping outside of that comfort zone when an opportunity presents itself. I think in career moves gone by, I would have thought, you know what, no, I'm just going to stay, because if I don't get it, what are people going to think of me? Whereas I think my relationship with how pressure has changed, like when the opportunity presented itself, I thought, I need to go for this. This is the next step. And actually the question of, well, what happens if I don't get it? What are people going to say? Doesn't even factor, because I just, like, my relationship with how that feeling shows up is so different. And again, I think we spoke about it earlier when I was talking about how you would lead people through pressure. But again, it's well, so what? Like, what? It doesn't matter what other people think of you, because we know that most of the time people's reflections on you are, that a mirror to themselves. So yeah, again, it's just, it's present. So that means that there's something good at the end of it.
Yeah. Have you always had that ability to not care about what other people think?
Oh no, definitely not. Definitely not. I think in that period of time where I was motivated quite heavily by shame, that's all I cared about really, and was so concerned about other people and their perception and, what they thought. and I was sort of doing things to prove myself to other people. But actually it's just the depth, understanding ourselves as human beings is such an empowering journey to go on. And let's be honest, it's never going to end. Like, it will continue forever, because we're complex and we're carrying our parents' generation and their generation, and the societal changes that have come with that. Like, there's so much complexity that lives within each and every one of ourselves. But being brave and vulnerable enough to start that journey, I think it's so empowering. And actually, one of the things that has been most empowering for me is not being bothered by what people think. And of course, that's not a broad brush term. Of course, I really value feedback and I really value people's opinion. But when there's context and relevance and a need for it, not sort of throwaway comments or snide comments or that kind of water cooler chat, like I've really noticed that just completely drains my energy. So it's tuning in on what's important.
Yes, love that. I love that idea of tuning in to what's important, because that has so much meaning on so many levels, doesn't it? And it's in a way what we were doing 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? We're just tuning in to what's important. And I think that so many of us and leaders that we're supporting at the moment are going so damn fast that the idea of slowing down to tune in to anything that's beyond the transactional or the tactical is really tough right now. What would your advice be to those other? I mean, you're in an organization that's going hell for leather and change is, normal. What would your advice be to anyone that just says, how do I do that, Mollie?
Yeah, we've got some great posters actually around the office. I've not seen them for a while, but there's one that says, even busy bees stop to smell the roses. And it is so important. And it's just such an important thing to remember, because if you are going at 100 miles an hour, you're going to miss opportunities. You're going to miss insights that could be like really commercially valuable. So it takes that brave individual and then brave leadership to say, just pause. Like, we're just going to pause and work out, like, is this the right thing to be doing? So I think, and practically there's a number of things. It's, checking in with teams on, like, we sometimes do energy audits, like, where's your energy at? Yeah. How do you feel? What's working? What's not? What do we need to share? What's a non-negotiable that we just need to drop? And of course, in utopia, everybody would do everything, but that's not going to make us be the best and set us up. There's no condition for success there if you're trying to do everything. So being really open and communicative as a team to understand, like, how is everybody doing? And then having a really clear North Star of, like, where are we actually going, and being ruthless with, okay, well, is this action going to get me towards that goal? And if it's not, we've got to drop it. But I think the important thing sometimes when there gets a bit of angst or things get even more tense in that, is when the communication then isn't there. Like, something gets dropped, but not everybody that's been involved is then aware that that's the change in tact and the sort of the route correction. So there's a number of practical steps that and it comes back to, like, basic communication, being open, creating that space for people to actually have the conversation. Yeah.
And so often you think it's so clear to you that it must be clear to everybody else. And I've communicated it once, so that's enough. So the repetition and creating that communication and the drumbeat of the shift that's going on is really important. Again, it requires you to slow down and separate from the tactics, separate from the tasks.
Yeah.
Brilliant, Mollie. So this segues nicely into the last two questions that I always ask a guest, which is, if there was somebody listening to this podcast wanting to be better under pressure, what would be your 2 pay forwards? I mean, you've mentioned loads, but if you had to put your money against 2, what would they be?
2 questions, I would say, for that person to ask themselves. And this is coming from an optimist as well, so the second question might not resonate, but the first one would be, what can I learn? And the second one would be, what's the worst that could happen? And, I am an eternal optimist. So if the second one doesn't resonate with people, you could say, 1, what would I learn? And 2, commit to smiling as you go into it.
I spoke to Julie Harris, and that was her, what's the worst can happen was her biggest pay forward is to really think in a sense of perspective, what actually is the worst that could happen? I mean, your jellyfish example is great because you just checked to see if it wasn't a lethal jellyfish. If it was a lethal jellyfish, then the worst that could happen is you could die and if you get back in the water. But once you'd eliminated that option, it was much easier to get back in the water.
Yeah, and I think, like you and I had spoken a number of times, like throughout the whole of last year, I was going through a number of kind of fertility issues, and I had 2 late miscarriages. And before the first one, I was on a global project at work, and I was, working really long hours, like early mornings, late nights. And then, we went for our 12-week scan and it wasn't great news. And then the subsequent 6 weeks was just a horrendous journey of like, you're in hospital, you're out of hospital, you're in A&E, you're there for ages, emergency surgery, et cetera, et cetera. And, when you're in those meetings and it's like, I need to get this deck done now, I would lose myself a bit. And then it's almost like, you then get a really serious punctuation mark that says, no, this is what perspective and this is what real challenge looks like. And it's just absolutely awful. And there's so many women going through it, but it serves as a reminder of like, in the mundane, what is the worst that's going to happen? And as long as your health is fine and those that are closest around you are fine. And the reality is you can't even control the second one. So as long as your health is fine, that is that's the most important thing. Like, am I at risk? No. Okay, great. Crack on. Give it a go. What are you going to learn from it?
Yeah. And just on that, am I at risk? And that's such a brilliant question, because I think some people go beyond that barrier and they do put themselves at risk, actually. How do you know that you're putting yourself, what's your warning signal to know that you actually are putting yourself at risk now?
Yeah, and I think I probably have only done that in the sporting context. Like, I've definitely been, there's being outside of your comfort zone, and then there's being completely at risk in a fairly foolish way. And for me, that's more about, there are elements of the environment that you will never be able to change. But if you're not prepared for those elements of the environment, you're basically just setting yourself up to fail. Because if you're out on the mountains and, the weather changes within seconds, it can be, sunny and glorious one minute, and then there can be a snowstorm. If you're not prepared for that, like, you're at great risk. So I think it's an element of, you've got to be prepared for every eventuality, which means taking a breath again and doing your homework. Like, how am I preparing for this? And, taking a big pack on the mountains, it's like, oh, I could need none of this kit, but actually I could need all of it.
Yeah.
And my best friend's husband always says, I'd rather be looking at it than for it. So I would rather be carrying, a pack for 10 kgs rather than 7, but actually a hailstorm or a snowstorm comes in and I have to bunk down for a little bit and I've got all my kit.
Yes. I love that. I'd rather be looking at it than for it.
Yeah.
It's a very good way of thinking about it. And I suppose, how would you transfer that, though, back to organizations? So the risk that I think I see somebody put themselves under is when their shed actually gets completely beyond the level of return, or the risk is that they've lost their team along the way.
Yeah.
And they've not seen that. So I'm curious to know how that transfers, that analogy of the packing and the mountain and being prepared and knowing that you've got everything on your back.
Yeah.
How does that transfer to what's the worst that can happen? Am I at risk in the way I'm working?
Yeah. I think actually the principles are the same about preparedness and having the foresight, because, burnout is a real thing for a lot of people. And actually, what's happened there is they've not necessarily looked long enough down the line to think, how sustainable is this? And to your point, shed is so important. And it's funny because my mind doesn't go to that because I'm so obsessive about sleep. And, the hydration, exercise, diet thing is kind of a given for me, but like sleep especially. So I think that preparedness, and it's, don't look too far beyond yourself, because we are the vehicles of our own success. So if we are not well rested and ready to get up and go again, then that's where the risk comes. Like, there's a kind of the classic saying of like, you wouldn't put poor fuel in a Ferrari. It's the same for us. Like, you've got to eat well, you've got to get yourself enough sleep, and you've got to hydrate and move. And the science speaks volumes for how quickly performance deteriorates when you're, dehydrated, tired. Like, I think reaction times, for a tired driver are similar to a drunk driver.
Totally.
Think about your cognition there. So the risk factors for me, it's just a lot more simple than even looking at, okay, well, what are we doing as a business? Like, how are we doing it, and how are our teams, what are our conditions for success for our teams?
Yeah. Do you tell people to, this is a phrase we use, shed off?
No,
like when they've just, like, just go shed off. Yeah. That's what someone in our team introduced into ours, and it was just such a good one, because we absolutely know what they mean when they say it to us. Mm. But do you spot that in people and tell them to just go and look after the basics?
Yeah, you can see it, and it's like, this isn't worth it. And then obviously you can say to someone, look, you should go, just go and relax, or take the day off, or this meeting isn't important. But that, you can lead a horse to water, but that person then has to not do it. And I think that's the difference. Like, in that personal accountability, you then have to say, okay, yeah, cool, I'm taking the time off.
Yeah. And that reverts me back to the whole idea of your, the pause between the stimulus and the response, because the habitual behavior has taken over, and they just keep going. They've lost the opportunity to actually stop and look.
Yeah, I had a really interesting conversation with an incredibly successful lady. She's about to take some time off in between roles to, just to rest and reset. And she was like, I just really want to make sure I'm actually resting. But she was thinking about the next thing, and like leaving this thing. And I said, well, how about what happens if you reframed that and used this as a celebration for what you've achieved up until now? And like her whole sort of persona and perspective changed, because she was like, oh, I'd not even taken a minute to stop and think about that. Like, I'm leaving 3 years of incredible work.
Yeah.
So we've got to give ourselves the permission to do that as well. We
really do. We really, really do. We're so either on to the next thing or worrying about the thing that might go wrong, as opposed to celebrating the things that we've already done.
Yeah, we have, I think it's Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. Like, we don't have influence on anything other than right now. And as philosophical as that may sound, it's true. So, because everyone's like, oh, well, you can, you can plan for the future. You can. But if you aren't sleeping and eating, your future output is not going to be great. So, like, what can you do right now that's going to help you towards that goal, rather than thinking about the future goal?
So agree. Mollie, thank you so, so much.
Pleasure.
What a great conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Better Under Pressure with me, Sara Milne Rowe. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe and let us know what you found useful, or what you'd like to know more about. And don't forget, if you'd like to sign up for our fortnightly Pressure Points newsletter, where I summarise key points from each conversation, you can find a link at saramilnerowe.com. If you're interested in any of the practices mentioned, check out my book, The Shed Method. Alternatively, you can find us at Coaching Impact, or me on LinkedIn and Instagram. Better Under Pressure was produced by the fab team at Smart Cookie Media. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.